Back in 2025, this movie Dhurandhar just absolutely exploded. We're talking a 600-crore blockbuster. And it told the story of this guy, Rehman Dakait, painting him as this legendary anti-hero. The tough guy with a heart of gold, fighting the system for his people. But what we see on the big screen, well, it often hides some pretty ugly truths.
See, the man this film is about wasn't some romantic revolutionary. The myth, he's a blockbuster hero. The reality, at just 15 years old, Rehman Dakait's first recorded murder victim wasn't a rival gangster or a corrupt official. It was his own mother. And that brutal, shocking fact, that's where our real story begins.
So it just begs the question, right? Who was the real man behind the legend? Was he some kind of Robin Hood, like some people genuinely believed? Or was he just a cold-blooded psychopath who was enabled and maybe even created by a broken system? Today, we're going to go way beyond the movie screen to find out.
To get a handle on the man, you first have to understand the place that made him, Lyari. It's this massive, dense neighborhood right in the heart of Karachi. And to understand Lyari, you really need to understand this idea of a vacuum.
There's this old saying, nature abhors vacuum. It basically just means that when the state disappears, when the government stops providing things like water or schools or security, something else will always rush in to take its place. Lyari was the perfect storm. Geographically, it's central, right in the thick of it, but systemically, it was completely abandoned.
Now, crime wasn't exactly a new thing in Lyari. Back in the 60s, you had these old school gangsters. They smuggled gold and hash, and if they had a problem, they settled it with knives. But then the 1980s hit, and the war in Afghanistan brought two new things into Pakistan that changed the entire game: heroin and the Kalashnikov. Suddenly, the game wasn't about knives anymore. It was about automatic weapons. And it was into this new, much bloodier world that Rehman was born. So Rehman was basically born into the life. His dad was already in the drug trade. But what made him different from all the others? What was it that turned him into a monster? Well, it all comes down to one specific, unforgivable act. Okay, so picture this, 1995. Rehman is just 15 years old. He escapes from police custody, goes straight home, and according to every record and account we have, he shoots his mother, Khadija Bibi, dead. Psychologists have a term for this, crossing the Rubicon. It's a point of no return. And this was his. Now, people still argue about why he did it. Some say he thought his mom was an informant. But honestly, the reason almost doesn't matter as much as the effect it had. The message that shot across Lyari was brutal and clear. If this man can kill his own mother, he can't be loyal to anyone. That act became his most powerful weapon. Pure, undiluted fear. And he absolutely used that fear like a weapon. By 2001, he had turned on his own mentor, a guy named Haji Lalu, and staged a coup. He declared himself the new Sardar, the new kingpin of Lyari. And that single act kicked off one of the bloodiest conflicts in Karachi's history, the Great Lyari Gang War, against his #1 rival, Arshad Papu. But here's the thing. Rehman was smart. He knew that you couldn't rule by fear alone forever. To really hold on to power, you need legitimacy. You need the people to actually be on your side. And this is where he played his masterstroke. He created something called the People's Aman Committee. Aman means peace, ironically. He took all that money from drugs and extortion and used it to build his own little parallel state. If you needed water, you didn't call the city, you called the PAC. If you had a fight with your neighbor, you didn't go to the police, you went to the PAC's court and got a verdict in an hour. He paid school fees, funded weddings, you name it. And this leads to a phenomenon you could call the Lyari Syndrome. It's this really twisted situation where a state fails its people so completely that they're forced to embrace the very monster who oppresses them. Why? Because he's the only one providing the basic services they need to survive. When the police would come looking for Rehman, it was these same people who would form human shields to protect him. So you have to be asking yourself, how does a gangster get so powerful that he's basically running his own little country? The answer is pretty simple, actually. He wasn't working alone. He had friends in very, very high places. To fight their political rivals on the streets, the ruling party in the province basically adopted the Lyari gangs as their own. The Home Minister at the time, Zulfikar Mirza, famously said on the record, talking about the People's Aman Committee, "They are my children." Let that sink in. This wasn't just turning a blind eye. This was active, open patronage. And that patronage came with some serious firepower.
That same home minister later admitted to issuing 300,000 arms licenses. 300,000. The state was literally, legally, arming gangsters to fight a proxy war on the streets of its biggest city. With that kind of political cover, Rahman was basically untouchable.
But here's the thing about being a political asset. You have a shelf life. By 2009, Rehman had gotten too big, too powerful. He wasn't just taking orders anymore, he was giving them. So the very same state that helped create him decided it was time to eliminate him. On August 9, 2009, he was killed in what they called a police encounter, which is widely believed to have been a staged execution.
But the death of Rehman Dakait didn't bring peace to Lyari, not even close. In fact, it just opened the door to something far, far worse. It unleashed a whole new level of unimaginable violence. Taking his place was his cousin, Uzair Baloch. And look, if Rehman was the cold, calculating strategist of the operation, Uzair was just a straight-up butcher. Under his command, the violence in Lyari reached levels of pure depravity that shocked everyone, even the people who thought they'd seen it all. And you don't have to take my word for it. The numbers tell the whole brutal story. Just look at the homicide rates in Karachi. Between 2010 and 2013, the exact years Uzair Baloch's crew was at the height of its power, the murder rate just goes through the roof. So much for that Robin Hood fairy tale. And it all climaxed in one of the most horrific incidents in the city's history. In March 2013, Uzair's gang finally captured their old rival, Arshad Papu. They tortured him, and then they beheaded him. And then they played football with his severed head in the streets. They burned his body and threw it in a sewer, just to make sure his family couldn't even give him a proper burial. This wasn't just a murder. It was a terrifying message.
So, after all of this, the violence, the politics, the rise and the fall, what's the ultimate lesson from the story of Rehman Dakait? Who or what is the real monster here?
Look, Rehman is dead. Uzair is in jail. But that vacuum we talked about at the very beginning, it's still there. Lyari still struggles with poverty, with neglect from the state, with a total lack of basic justice. Killing the gangsters didn't kill the conditions that keep breeding them.
And that leaves us with one final, unavoidable question. The next time you're watching a movie that makes a gangster look like a hero, remember the reality of Lyari, and then ask yourself, who's really responsible for creating the monster? Is it the person who pulls the trigger? Or is it the systemic silence and the complete failure of the state that put the gun in his hand in the first place?